He had been counting the dead for 11 days when the vox crackled and someone answered. Before that, before the crackle, before the voice, before everything that came after, there was the station. There was always the station. Vigil Actual did not feel like a place men were meant to live. It had been built for function, not habitation. A relay node strung between two systems, like a knot in a vast, invisible thread, its purpose to catch signals falling through the dark and throw them onward. The Mechanicus adepts who designed it had not concerned themselves with comfort. The corridors were narrow enough that a broad-shouldered man had to turn sideways at the junctions. The lighting ran in low amber strips along the floor rather than overhead, which meant that every shadow fell upward, pooling in the ceiling rather than the ground, so that walking the station's passages felt like moving through something submerged. The air recyclers maintained temperature without warmth. The walls were bare, dark metal etched with the cog and skull motif of the Omnissiah's faith, repeated at intervals with the mechanical devotion of a thing that had no concept of excess. Trooper Caden Voss had stopped noticing the walls on day 3. He had stopped noticing most things by then. What he had not stopped doing was the log. He sat at the Vox station in the communications bay, the room that had been Specialist Daria Kale's domain before, with the log open on the steel-topped desk beside him. And he wrote. He wrote because it was something to do with his hands. He wrote because he had decided on day 2 that someone would eventually come, and when they came, they would want to know who had been here. He wrote because the alternative was to sit in the amber-lit silence and count the hours, and he had learned by day 4 that counting hours was a path to a place he might not walk back from. The log had 30 entries. The station complement had been 31 souls. He had not yet written the 31st name. He told himself he wasn't sure of the spelling. He told himself he would get to it. He moved the low stick from his left hand to his right, turned the pen in his fingers, and did not get to it. The low sticks were not lit. He had stopped lighting them on day 5, when he'd calculated he had 14 left, and no way to know how long he'd need them to last. The ritual of the thing, the holding, the small mechanical comfort of something between his fingers that wasn't a weapon and wasn't a stylus, was enough. He had found that his hands shook less when they were occupied. The mind, deprived of enough to do, turned inward. The hands needed something to hold so the mind could be kept, barely facing outward. He was very tired. Not the tiredness of poor sleep, though that was present too. He slept in 2-hour intervals, woke, checked the perimeter feeds, ate something from the ration stores, slept again. It was a deeper tiredness than that. The tiredness that comes from being the only thing in a space that requires tending, and tending it anyway because the alternative is to stop. And stopping is not something a guardsman does while he is still breathing. He had been tending Vigil Actual for 11 days. He had checked every corridor. He had sealed every external access point that could be sealed. He had eaten with the mechanical regularity of a man fulfilling a biological obligation rather than taking a meal, had slept with the shallow vigilance of an animal rather than the surrendered weight of a human being at rest. He was, in the precise clinical sense of the term, used up. Not afraid. That was the thing he had noticed most clearly, somewhere around day 7. The fear had gone. Not retreated, not suppressed, simply depleted. Fear, he had discovered, requires a kind of energy, a metabolic cost that the body pays in cortisol and elevated heart rate, and the particular sharpness behind the eyes that comes from believing, actively, that danger is present. He had maintained that belief for 6 days before his body simply declined to continue funding it. There was nothing left to be afraid with. What remained in its place was something older and quieter, a flat, functional awareness of his situation that carried no particular emotional color. He was alive. The others were not. He was waiting. Something would either come, or it would not. On day 8, he had walked the full length of the station from the communications bay to the lower maintenance decks, checking every room, every sealed compartment, every junction where the amber light pooled upward into ceiling shadows. He had done this not because he expected to find anything. He had stopped expecting things, but because movement was better than stillness, and he had needed to give his legs something to do while his mind was occupied. He had not gone near the astropath's tower. The tower occupied the station's highest point, a narrow spire accessible via a single sealed ladder shaft, its door coded to the astropath's own biometric signature. On day 3, after he had found the last of the others and understood the full shape of what had happened, he had gone to the shaft door and stood before it for a long time. There had been nothing to hear, no sound from above. He had pressed his hand against the door and felt the faint vibration of the station's systems humming through the metal, and that was all. On day 6, he was precise about this. He had checked the log. He had heard something. Not from outside the station, from above, from the tower. Not screaming, he told himself, when he thought about it afterward. It hadn't been screaming. He wasn't sure what it had been. He had written in the log, Day 6, 0340 station time. Sound from Astropath Tower, indeterminate, not repeated. And then he had closed the log and gone back to his 2-hour sleep cycle and had not climbed the ladder shaft, and he would not climb the ladder shaft, and he had made his peace with not knowing what had happened to Astropath Sen because the door was sealed, and his peace was a thin and necessary thing that he could not afford to puncture. He said the litany of endurance instead. He said what he could remember of it, which was the beginning. The Emperor is my armor against the darkness. The Emperor is my... And then something he couldn't retrieve. And then the second half of the second line arrived without the first, and he stitched them together badly and started again. He had said it so many times in 11 days that the words had become a kind of percussive comfort, divorced from meaning. The rhythm of them rather than the content. The shape his mouth made. The small anchor of a thing that had been taught to him before all of this, and therefore belonged to a world in which things were taught and learned and remembered properly. He had begun to say it aloud, quietly, to fill the silence. The silence in Vigil Actual was not empty. It was full of the station's mechanical voice, the recyclers, the low hum of the power conduits, the occasional distant clank of a cooling duct adjusting its gauge. But beneath all of that was a silence that those sounds could not touch. He had never noticed it before the others were gone. Silence, he understood now, was not the absence of sound. It was the absence of people. He had 30 entries in the log. He had a pen in his right hand and a cold glow stick in his left, and the amber light falling upward around him. And he was very tired, and the 31st name waited on the blank line at the bottom of the page, and he turned the pen in his fingers and told himself he would get to it. The Vox unit on Kyle's desk had not been silent for 11 days. Static ran through it continuously. The particular hiss of deep space transmission noise, which Kyle had once told him was actually the oldest sound in the universe. Residual radiation from the moment of creation filtered through the warp's interference, though she'd been smiling when she said it, and he hadn't been sure she was serious. He had grown so accustomed to the static that it had joined the recyclers and the conduits in the category of sounds that were not silence. He no longer heard it. So it took him a moment, when the pitch changed, to understand that what he was hearing was different. He looked up from the log. The static shifted, stuttered, and then, through it, clear and procedural and absolutely correct in every detail of its imperial formatting, a voice. Vigil Actual. This is Relief Squad Auric, responding to Distress Beacon Delta 7 Sigma. Authentication code follows. Vermilion 9 Crestfall 22. We are 12 standard hours from your position. Please confirm you are receiving. Vigil Actual, this is Relief Squad Auric. He sat very still for 3 full seconds. Then he reached out, and his hand was shaking. The glow stick fell from his left hand and he did not notice, and he pressed the transmission key. Relief Squad Auric, he said, and his voice came out wrong, rough and disused. The voice of a man who had been speaking only the fragments of a prayer aloud for 11 days. He cleared his throat, tried again. Relief Squad Auric, this is Trooper Caden Voss, sole survivor, Vigil Actual. I am receiving. The authentication code is confirmed, 12 hours. He released the key. The static filled back in. He sat in the amber light with his empty left hand open on the desk. He had not thanked the Emperor since the first day, since before he had understood the full shape of what the station had become. He had said the fragments of the litany because the litany was something to say. But he had not thanked the Emperor, had not addressed him directly, because there had seemed to be something dishonest in thanking the God Emperor of mankind for the continued function of his own lungs when 30 other sets of lungs had stopped. But now, in the amber silence, in the glow of a Vox unit that had just carried a human voice across the dark to reach him, he closed his eyes, and he said it. Simple, direct. Not the formal address, not the full invocation. Just, thank you. It felt for just a moment like being human again. 12 hours. He reached down and picked up the yellow stick from where it had fallen, turned it in his fingers, and began to think about what to say to them when they arrived. What to report, how to explain 30 entries in the log, and a sealed tower, and 11 days of amber silence. He did not yet wonder how they had known the right authentication codes. He did not yet wonder how a relief squad had reached his position so quickly when the nearest garrison system was 3 weeks out by standard transit. He was too tired for wonder. He would have time later to wish he had asked those questions before they came. Chapter 2. The Shape of Relief. They came in correct. That was the first thing Voss noticed, and the first thing he chose not to think about. He had rehearsed this moment across 11 days without meaning to. In the hollow hours between sleep intervals, in the amber silence of corridors he had walked so many times he no longer saw them. Some part of him had been composing the scene, the docking clamp engaging, the pressure equalization hiss, the sound of boots on the boarding ramp. He had imagined it loudly, chaotically, the way relief actually arrived in his experience. Men talking over each other, equipment clanging, someone calling out a name before the hatch was fully open. The beautiful, ungoverned noise of people who did not know they were a miracle. What he got instead was 12 soldiers moving in a single file down the boarding ramp, in perfect interval, kit secured, weapons at rest carry, eyes forward. The squad leader, a broad, unhurried man who introduced himself as Sergeant Aldrich Fenn, stepped off the ramp last, looked at Voss standing in the docking bay with his log under one arm and a cold glow stick in his hand, and extended a handshake with the easy confidence of a man who had done this kind of thing many times and found it unremarkable. "Trooper Voss," he said, "you held." 3 words. Voss had not cried in 11 days, had not had the reserves for it, and he did not cry then either. But something happened behind his sternum that he didn't have a name for. Something that had been braced for 11 days eased, fractionally, under the weight of being seen by another human being. "Yes, Sergeant," he said. "I held." Fenn nodded once, as if this settled something, and turned to direct his squad's dispersal through the station. He moved with the particular economy of a man who had been a soldier for long enough that authority had become physical, carried in the posture rather than performed in the voice. His lasgun had a grip wrapped in friction tape, the original surface worn down to nothing beneath it. When Voss glanced at it, Fen caught him looking and said, without particular emphasis, "New grips feel wrong. I'd rather the tape." Voss understood this completely. It was the most human sentence he had heard in 11 days. The Medici was the second one off the ramp. She had introduced herself as Osler. No rank offered initially, just the name, delivered with the brisk efficiency of someone who had decided long ago that titles were for documentation rather than conversation. She was lean, dark-eyed, and carried her Medici kit with the unconscious ease of long familiarity. Within 20 minutes of docking, she had located the station's secondary briefing room, commandeered its table as an examination surface, and informed Voss that she would be assessing him before he did anything else. He had expected the standard survey: pulse, pupils, hydration, a few questions about his sleep and ration intake. What he received instead was something considerably more thorough. She worked without speaking, which he appreciated. The examination moved from his hands. She checked his grip strength, the fine tremors he hadn't noticed in himself, upward through his arms, his shoulders, the column of his neck. She placed her fingers with geometric precision, each contact point deliberate, and her hands were very cool against his skin in a way that registered as professional rather than unpleasant. He focused on the wall behind her and let himself be assessed. Then she pressed 2 fingers into the left side of his ribcage, at an angle he wouldn't have thought to examine, and he made a sound he hadn't planned on making. "Cracked rib," she said. "4th intercostal, hairline. You've been splinting it unconsciously. See how you're carrying your left shoulder? You've been doing this for days." "I didn't know." "The body compensates," she said, already moving downward. "It's efficient that way. Also," she pressed her thumb into the back of his left knee, behind the joint. "There's a partial tear here. Ligament. You've been favoring it." He thought about the 11 days of corridor walking, the maintenance decks, the ladder shaft he'd climbed to check the upper ventilation seals. He had been limping, he understood now, a slight automatic transfer of weight that he had never registered consciously, because his conscious mind had been elsewhere. "How did you find those so quickly?" he asked. She looked up from his knee. She was smiling, not warmly exactly, but with the contained satisfaction of competence acknowledged. "It's my purpose," she said. He didn't think about the word choice. He filed it beside the other observations he was not thinking about, and shifted his weight off the knee she had just correctly diagnosed. She counted things. He noticed this across the examination. Tiles, when her eyes tracked across the floor. The number of paces between the table and the kit. The doses she prepared in a sequence accompanied by a faint, sub-vocalized count. When he mentioned it, she glanced up without embarrassment and said, "It keeps my mind ordered. I lose the count, I start again." He found it charming. Specific human habits were charming. He was so glad to be in a room with specific human habits. They ate together in the station's mess bay, a room that had felt for 11 days like the most desolate space in the structure, its long table set for people who would not come. Now it held 13. The relief squad ate their own rations. They had not wanted to deplete his stores, Fen said, not until they knew the full situation. And he ate from the station's remaining provisions, which were better than his rationed diet had been. And the food tasted, for the first time in almost a fortnight, like something. He talked. He had not realized how much he needed to talk until he began and could not stop. The events of the first day, the second, the systematic way the situation had unraveled, the decisions he'd made and the ones he'd deferred, the log, the corridors, the small structured rituals that had kept him functional when function was all he had left to offer. Fen listened the way experienced soldiers listen, not performing attention, but genuinely still, the kind of stillness that reserves judgment until the picture is complete. He asked 2 questions in 20 minutes, both precise, both aimed at information rather than comfort. The second one was about the astropath's tower. Voss told him, sealed since day 3, biometrically coded to Senna's signature, one indeterminate sound on day 6 that had not repeated. He told him without elaboration. Fenn received it without expression, nodded, and returned his attention to his ration. They did not go to the tower that night. Nobody suggested it. Voss did not find this strange. At 600 station time the following morning, Fenn gathered the squad for prayer. Voss stood at the edge of the group, not quite part of it, not quite outside it, and listened. Fenn led them through the litany of endurance. His voice was level, neither performative nor mechanical, carrying the cadence of something said regularly. The squad responded in unison at the appropriate intervals, with the comfortable synchrony of long shared practice. Every word, every line. The middle stanzas that Voss could not retrieve no matter how he reached for them. They had them, all of them, without a pause, without the small stumble of genuine recall, without the particular rhythm of a living memory being accessed in real time. He felt something he identified as inadequacy. He had been alone for 11 days with the opening line of this prayer and the fractured second half, and he had stitched them together badly, and here were 12 soldiers who knew it whole because they were soldiers, and soldiers learned the litanies properly, and his failure to retain them was a function of the 11 days and not a reflection of anything else. He decided this. He held to it. He mouthed the words he knew alongside them and let the rest pass. In the afternoon, a sound from the lower corridor. Voss heard it first. A hollow knock, irregular, somewhere below the communications bay. His body responded before his mind had assessed it. He was on his feet with his laser gun in his hands and his back against the wall in the same motion, the calcified reflex of 11 days of corridor walking. One of the relief squad, a younger soldier whose name he hadn't caught yet, appeared from the adjacent room and fell in beside him without being asked. They moved to the lower corridor together, the soldier 2 paces back and left, covering the angle. Good positioning, good instincts. The sound led them to the maintenance passage that ran beneath the communications bay, past the junction that angled toward the astropath's tower ladder shaft. Voss tracked the sound past the shaft without looking at it. The soldier beside him did the same, which he noted without noting it. The source was a coolant pipe. It had developed a fracture at the elbow joint, not from damage, simply from age and pressure, and was releasing a percussive knock each time the station's thermal cycling caused the metal to contract and reseat. Standard maintenance failure. Nothing. The soldier looked at the pipe, looked at Voss, said dryly, 11 days alone and the pipe nearly killed you. Voss laughed. He laughed genuinely, the startled, involuntary kind, and the sound of it in the narrow corridor was strange to him. Too loud for the space, too alive. The soldier smiled, and they walked back to the upper level, and the tension that had ratcheted through Voss's shoulders since the first sound released in increments as they climbed. His guard came down. He didn't notice it coming down. That was, of course, the point. That night, in the communications bay, Voss opened the log to the blank line at the bottom. He had been avoiding it since the relief squad's arrival. There had always been something else. The examination, the meal, the patrol schedule Fenn had asked him to walk through, the prayer he had mouthed with the wrong words. But now the bay was quiet and the squad was in the barracks, and there was no reason to wait any longer. He wrote, Kyle, Daria, Specialist, Communications Officer. He stopped, added, Found day 2, Communications Bay, 0218 station time. Vox unit destroyed. Not beside her, around her. He looked at those last 3 words. They were the precise problem. The Vox unit had not simply been damaged in the violence that had taken Kale. It had been shattered outward from her position, as though she had been the center of something catastrophic, and the equipment had been caught in the radius. He had not been able to determine what that meant. He had filed it as indeterminate in the incident record, and moved on because the alternative was to stay with the question, and the question had edges he could not afford to cut himself on alone. He closed the log. When he looked up, Sergeant Fenn was standing in the doorway. The lamp at Fenn's back cast him mostly in silhouette. Voss could see the outline of him, the taped laser gun slung at his side, the squared posture that didn't shift or lean. His expression was not visible from across the room. There was a half-second in which it was simply Fenn's shape in the doorway, features unreadable, perfectly still. Then the amber light caught his face as he tilted his head slightly, and there was the warmth, the settled, competent warmth that Voss had found so anchoring since the man had stepped off the boarding ramp. "You're up late," Fenn said. "Anything you need before lights down?" "No," Voss said. "Thank you, Sergeant." Fenn nodded once and was gone. Voss sat for a moment listening. The grating in this section of the station was a medium-gauge steel mesh, the kind that rang under a boot heel with a particular metallic note. He had heard it under his own feet 10,000 times in 11 days. It was the sonic texture of the station's floor, as constant as the recyclers and the conduit hum. He had heard nothing when Fenn walked away. He sat very still and thought about this with the same flat, functional awareness he had been applying to everything for 11 days. Imperial issue boots, standard tread, medium gauge steel mesh. The physics of the thing produced a sound. The physics had always produced a sound. He was very tired. He had a cracked rib he had not known about, and a damaged knee he had been walking on for days, and 11 days of 2-hour sleep intervals sitting behind his eyes. Tired men misheard things, or failed to hear them. The recycler cycle had shifted. He'd noticed that this afternoon, the hum dropping a register. Perhaps the acoustic balance of the corridor had shifted with it. Perhaps something in the maintenance passage had changed the resonance pattern. He closed his eyes. He told himself it was nothing. He went to his cot and lay on his back and stared at the ceiling, and the amber light moved in its slow strip along the floor, and somewhere in the station's lower levels, the coolant pipe ticked and reseated and ticked again. He told himself it was nothing. He kept telling himself for a long time before his eyes closed. Chapter 3. The inventory of small wrongness. By the 3rd day with the relief squad, Voss had a list. He hadn't meant to make it. He'd just started noticing. The first item was small enough that he nearly didn't record it even in the private ledger of his own attention. He had been in the mess bay at 0700, working through his morning ration. Reconstituted protein paste and a cup of recaf that the station's fabricator produced with the same tired consistency it had maintained for 11 days. When he realized that none of the relief squad were eating. They were present. 7 of them occupied the table's far end, kit squared away, conversation running in the low register of soldiers at ease. But no one had a ration open. No one was drinking. In 12 hours of shared meals, he had not once seen any of them eat. They ate before arrival, probably, he thought. Transit rations. They're not hungry. He looked at his paste, ate it, filed the observation, and moved on. The second item arrived the same morning, during Osla's daily examination. She had established a routine, 0730, briefing room, 10 minutes, which he had accepted with the docility of a man grateful for structure. She worked through the same sequence each time, the same contact points in the same order, her cool hands moving with the precision of a recorded procedure being replayed. That morning, when she pressed 2 fingers to his wrist to count his pulse, he noticed that her skin was exactly the same temperature it had been the first time and the second. Not cold, not warm, consistent. As though her body maintained a fixed temperature, independent of the station's ambient heat, which had been running slightly warmer since the relief squad arrived, and filled the corridors with, he'd assumed, body heat. He mentioned it, obliquely, said her hands were always the same. She glanced up with the contained half-smile he had come to recognize as her version of warmth. "Circulation condition," she said. "My thermoregulation runs narrow. Some people's do." Reasonable, he thought. He watched her finish the examination. Her hands moved to his ribs, the cracked fourth intercostal, and her fingers found the exact position they had occupied yesterday and the day before, with an accuracy that was either impeccable clinical memory or something else entirely that he did not want to name. He thanked her and went back to the communications bay. He had begun sleeping in longer intervals since the squad's arrival. 3 hours, sometimes 4, which he understood as his body reclaiming debt. He still woke multiple times each night. Old reflex. The station had been his alone long enough that silence still read as a variable requiring assessment. On the 3rd night, he woke at 0340, the same time he had heard the sound from the astropath's tower on day 6. He lay still in the dark and listened. Breathing. Present, regular, in the adjacent bunk. 2 of the squad had been assigned to quarters near his. A deliberate arrangement, Fen had said, so that Voss wasn't isolated during the decompression period after prolonged solitary stress. He appreciated the consideration. He listened to the breathing. It was even, controlled. He tried to identify in it the small variations of genuine sleep, the slight deepening, the occasional shift toward irregularity, the unconscious rhythms that sleeping bodies made. He listened for several minutes. The breathing was perfectly even, perfectly regular, like a metronome set to the correct value and maintained there without variation. Light sleepers, he thought. Soldiers sleep light. He'd slept light himself for 11 days. He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, the breathing was still perfectly even, and the corridor outside his quarters held, in the amber dark, 2 standing shapes that were not moving, not patrolling, not adjusting position, standing. He watched them through the gap of his partially open door for 4 minutes before deciding they were standing watch. Good soldiers maintained watch schedules, and closing his eyes again. They were still there when he checked at 0510. He did not check again after that. The 4th item came from the Vox Bay. The squad's Vox operator, a compact, precise woman who had given her name as Tannic, ran the communications equipment with the quiet efficiency of someone for whom the work was genuinely second nature. Voss had been back in the bay several times each day, maintaining his own logs, and he had watched Tannic receive transmissions, log them, adjust the equipment's calibration in response to the region's interference patterns. He had never once seen her initiate an outbound transmission. Relief squads reported in. It was protocol, position confirmation, status update, extraction timeline. He knew this. He had spent 11 days trying to reach someone outbound on this same equipment, and failing. But the relief squad's transmitter was a field unit, higher powered, rated for the region's interference. There was no technical reason not to send. He asked casually while reviewing the logs, "Have you been able to reach command? Update our status?" Tannic looked up from the calibration she was running. "Uplinks intermittent," she said. "This region. We're logging it on our end." They'll have the record when we're back in range. Standard for the area, he thought. He'd had the same problem for 11 days. He nodded and returned to the logs. That night he lay on his cot and thought about the authentication codes they had provided on first contact. Correct codes, correct unit designation, correct officer rank. All of that had come through clearly. The same interference that now prevented outbound transmission had not, apparently, affected the precision of that first incoming call. He turned onto his side. His damaged knee ached. He told himself the interference patterns in void space were inconsistent, and that this explained it fully and completely. And he made himself believe it because the alternative was a door he was not yet willing to open. The fifth item was Fenn's memory. It surfaced over 2 days, gradually enough that he almost didn't mark it as unusual. In the course of normal conversation, meals, patrol briefings, the natural accumulation of time shared in a confined space, Voss had mentioned things, names from the dead roster, the sequence of events on day 1, small details, the way Adept Corvin had kept his mechadendrites folded during formal exchanges, a personal habit Voss had found both odd and endearing, the particular brand of low sticks Trooper Masson had favored, and the fact that he'd never shared them. The exact phrasing Kale had used the last time Voss had seen her alive. A brief exchange about the calibration of the long-range antenna. Fenn quoted them back. Not paraphrased, quoted. Verbatim in sequence, days after they had been mentioned once in passing. Sharp memory, Voss thought. Career soldiers developed it. Operational context required retention. He had known men with memories like that. His first sergeant had been able to recite a full patrol debrief 6 days after the fact, without notes. He filed it. He moved on. He repeated Fenn's explanation to himself with the particular insistence of a man who has noticed that he is arguing with no one. The sixth item was the smell. It had developed gradually, somewhere between day 2 and day 4 of the squad's presence. Not rot. He knew what rot smelled like in a confined space, and this was not it. Not sweat, not the close animal warmth of bodies in proximity. Something older, something that existed at the threshold of detection, below the recycler's filtered air and the omnipresent metallic undertone of the station's structure, present only when he stood still and breathed deliberately. He mentioned it to Osler. She frowned, tested the air with the clinical attention she brought to everything, and suggested the recycler filters might be contaminated. Biological growth in the carbon matrix was not uncommon in stations that had gone on reduced maintenance. He put in a filter check request on the maintenance log. The smell did not change. The seventh item, the shadow, he almost did not write down at all, because it was the kind of thing that could not survive the light of scrutiny. On the second day, the station had experienced a brief power fluctuation, 12 seconds of emergency lighting before the primary systems restored. In the amber half-dark of those 12 seconds, Voss had been standing 3 meters from Fenn in the briefing room, and he had seen, or believed he had seen, Fenn's shadow move. Not with Fenn, before him. A fraction of a second in advance, the shadow casting itself into a position the body had not yet occupied. The lights came back. Fenn was standing normally, looking at the ceiling with the mild interest of a man waiting out a technical inconvenience. Trick of the light, Voss thought. Emergency lighting was directional, amber, moving. Shadows in directional moving light did strange things. He had seen stranger. He wrote it down anyway with the notation disregard, optical artifact, and moved on. The 8th item was the regiment. He had asked one of the younger soldiers. Privates didn't usually warrant much conversation, but the station's confinement made casual exchange inevitable. Where he'd come from before Oryx Squad. The soldier had answered without hesitation. The Krieg 143rd. Voss had served alongside Krieg regiments twice. He knew the designation structure. He also knew with the certainty of a man who had read enough Departamento Munitorum briefings in the long administrative hours of garrison duty that the 143rd Death Corps had been annihilated during the siege actions at Vrax. Not reduced, annihilated 3 decades ago. There was no rebuilt iteration. Krieg didn't rebuild destroyed regiments under the same designation. They issued new numbers. That was doctrine. The soldier's expression had not changed. Secondment from a different unit. Misremembered designation, Voss thought. Soldiers got unit numbers wrong, especially if they'd served in multiple attachments. He let it go. He wrote it down. The 9th item was Osler's eyes. He had been watching. Not obviously, not with the focused attention that would have been visible, but watching, with the peripheral awareness of a man who has been alone in a dangerous space long enough that observation has become involuntary. 3 conversations, different lengths, different contexts, different emotional registers. Osler had not blinked once during direct eye contact. People blinked. The average was 15 times per minute, involuntary, below conscious control. He had sat across from Osler for a combined total of perhaps 20 minutes of direct conversation over 3 days, and he had counted. Because once you started counting Osler's things, you couldn't stop, and he had counted 0. He was being ridiculous. He was a man 11 days into extreme isolation stress being assessed daily by a medici, and he was counting his doctor's blinks and finding conspiracy in dry eyes. He was being absolutely ridiculous. He wrote it down. He might have stopped at 12. He had 12 items, each rationalized, each filed with its explanation, and he had told himself, repeatedly, with the same insistence he'd applied to Fenn's memory and the regiment's designation, that the cumulative weight of 12 coincidences did not constitute evidence of anything except a tired man's deteriorating signal-to-noise ratio. Then, on the 4th morning, in the mess bay, Fenn clapped Tannic on the shoulder. Voss saw it happen. A brief, companionable contact, the natural grammar of soldiers at ease, the kind of gesture that accumulated invisibly across shared service until it was simply part of how people occupied the same space. It happened. It was real. And every other member of the relief squad within eyeline turned their heads toward it simultaneously. Not toward Fenn, not toward Tannic. Toward the point of contact. Toward the place where one of them had touched another. With the focused, involuntary attention of people who had not seen this before and found it. For just a half second, just long enough to be visible before the normalcy reasserted itself and heads turned away. Remarkable. Voss put his recaf down. He thought about 11 days of shared corridors, shared meals, shared quarters, 12 people moving through a confined space and sleeping in adjacent cots and working in close proximity. And in 4 days, he had seen them make casual physical contact once. And the rest of them had looked at it like it was a word in a language they had learned from books but never heard spoken aloud. He told himself it was discipline. He wrote it at the bottom of the list. Then he tore the page from the log, walked to the nearest junction, held it over the amber strip lighting until it caught, and watched it burn. He held it until the heat reached his fingers. He watched the ash drift down to the grating. He did not write the list again. He had not forgotten a single item. That night, he found the pict feed. It was an old system, maintenance grade, never intended for security, accessible through a tertiary terminal in the engineering sub-bay that he had discovered on day 4 of his original solitude. Low resolution, no sound, covering 6 internal areas in rotating 5-second windows. He had used it to check corridors during the worst of the early days, before he had mapped the full shape of what had happened and understood that checking corridors was not going to change anything. He sat before it now in the dark of the sub-bay, engineering systems humming around him, and he called up the barracks. The screen was grey and low contrast, the image shifting between capture points. He found the angle that covered the main barracks bay and held it there, overriding the rotation. The bay. The cots, 12 of them, arranged in 2 rows. Equipment stowed with regulation precision along the walls. The amber emergency strip running along the floor. 12 figures, all present, all lying on their cots in the postures of rest. Arms straight, eyes closed, faces upward. Spaced at exact identical intervals. Perfectly still, with the stillness of things that had arranged themselves in the correct position and then simply stopped. Not sleeping. He did not know. Watching them. How he knew. He knew the way you knew when a room had been staged, when the lived-in disorder of genuine occupation was absent, and what remained was a performance of occupation. They were lying correctly, in the positions that sleeping soldiers lay, and they were not sleeping. The picked feed had no sound. He watched the 12 still figures and felt the silence of it pressing against him through the screen. Sergeant Fenn was in the nearest cot. His face was visible in the feed's grey resolution, the broad, competent face that had said you held and meant it, or had produced the sounds and the expression of meaning it, and Voss could no longer locate the difference. Fenn's head turned, not preceded by any motion of the shoulders, the neck, the shift of weight that preceded human movement. The head simply rotated, smoothly, incrementally, until Fenn's face was directed at the pick capture lens mounted high on the wall, and was still. The pick capture had no external indicator light. There was no light, no sound, no signal that it was active. There was no way to know it was running. Fenn's expression did not change. Fenn raised one hand, slowly, with the measured deliberateness of something making itself understood, and waved. Voss closed the terminal. He sat in the dark of the engineering sub-bay with the hum of the station systems around him, and his hands flat on the desk, and his breathing very careful and very controlled, and he did not move for a very long time. Chapter 4. The weight of what you know. He had to keep acting like he didn't know. That was the only thing keeping him alive, and it was the thing that was going to break him. He sat in the engineering sub-bay until 0300, not planning, not cataloguing, simply sitting with the terminal dark before him, and his hands flat on the desk, running the same sequence of thoughts in the same order until they wore smooth grooves in his mind and stopped producing anything new. He had sat until the physical reality of the station reasserted itself. The recycler hum, the thermal click of the cooling ducts, his own heartbeat. And until those things were enough to anchor him back inside his body, which needed to function, which needed to walk back to his quarters and lie down and be visible in the morning, doing the things a man with no knowledge did. A man with no knowledge ate breakfast. He made conversation. He did not look at the people across the table and think about what he had seen their sergeant's head do in the dark. He lay on his cot and did not sleep and rehearsed the performance until first light. The astropath's tower had been waiting for 11 days and then 4 more. 15 days of sealed door and amber silence, and the single sound he had never described accurately even to himself, because accurate description required sitting with it, and he had been too afraid to sit with it. He was more afraid now. But fear, he had relearned this morning, was a fuel. 11 days of depletion had left him running on the flat, functional register of pure endurance, but last night had refilled something. What he felt now was not the exhausted absence of emotion he'd carried since day 3. It was sharp and cold, and it moved him. He went to the tower at 900, when the squad's rotation had Fenn and 4 others in the lower maintenance decks running a hull integrity check. His suggestion, made at breakfast with the easy casualness of a man performing helpfulness. The rest were in the barracks. Osler was in the briefing room with her kit. He had perhaps 20 minutes. The ladder shaft door had a manual override, a physical bypass for the biometric lock, accessible through a panel in the shaft wall, intended for emergency maintenance access. He had known about it since day 4. He had chosen not to use it for 15 days, because there is a particular mercy in not knowing things, and he had wanted to preserve that mercy for as long as possible. He pulled the panel, worked the override. The door released with a sound like an indrawn breath, and he climbed. The astropath's chamber was small and circular. The walls curved inward toward a peaked ceiling, fitted with null field emitters that had long since gone dark. The equipment Senna had worked with, the resonance cradle, the psychic focus array, was destroyed, not damaged. Destroyed systematically with the deliberate thoroughness of something making certain no signal could leave. The cradle had been reduced to component pieces, each piece placed a precise distance from the others, as though the destruction had been measured. Senna was not there. Voss did not look for long at the dark staining on the floor near the focus array. He looked at the walls. She had written on them, not with a stylus or pigment, with something that had burned the text into the stone itself, scorched black letters that he recognized as psychic imprint, the desperate last resort of an untrained hand, using a trained ability past its limit. He had seen psychic imprint once before, on a citation wall in a ruined chapel during his second deployment. The letters had the same quality, too precise for the circumstances, as though the mind producing them had concentrated everything remaining into the single task of making them legible. High Gothic. He was not fluent. He worked through it slowly, moving along the wall with his lamp raised, his lips forming words as his comprehension assembled itself from fragments of litanies and formal notices and the occasional briefing document that had passed through his hands over a decade of service. Most of it was sequence, dates, designations, the technical vocabulary of astropathic protocol, the message she had tried to send before they reached her. He pieced it together in fragments. Vigil actual under infiltration. Station complement compromise from within. Source, Xenos biological. 3rd and 4th generation hybrids, visually indistinct from baseline human. Hybrids accessed command Vox records. Extracted authentication protocols. Preparing mimicry of distress response. He stopped. He read that again. He read it until each word had settled into its final, irrevocable meaning. Accessing distress beacon transmission content, constructing identity architecture from beacon data, unit designation, officer names, authentication, all sourced from beacon. Do not trust response. Do not. The writing became less legible here, the letters losing precision, the hand that burned them losing something. He tracked it to the wall's curve, where the text grew large and ragged, and finally reduced to a single line, cut deepest of all into the stone, as if the last strength she had went entirely into making it permanent. They wear the faces of whoever you most need to see. Voss lowered his lamp. He stood in the astropath's ruined chamber, 15 days of careful not knowing finally and completely over, and he understood the full shape of it. They had heard his beacon. Not rescue coming toward it, something else, something that had listened to 11 days of his distress signal, broadcasting his authentication codes and unit affiliations and the designation of the relief force he was requesting, and had learned him from the outside in, had assembled from the data of his desperation the exact shape of what he needed to find at the end of it. Fen, the taped grip. New grips feel wrong. A detail so specific, so human, so precisely the kind of thing a real soldier carried. Where had they found that detail? In the beacon data? in something they had already known about human soldiers from other stations, other survivors, other isolated men who had wanted to believe. Osler, it's my purpose. He had thought it an unusual word choice, and filed it, and moved on because she had been kind to him, and he had needed kindness like a structural element, like something weight-bearing. And now the kindness was retroactive horror, and the weight it had been bearing came down. He had laughed at breakfast this morning. Fenn had said something, a dry observation about the station's recaf fabricator producing the same flavor regardless of setting, as though it has one opinion and has committed to it. And Voss had laughed. Genuinely. The involuntary kind, up from the chest before he'd had the opportunity to decide whether it was safe. And Fenn had smiled, and for one moment it had simply been two soldiers at breakfast, and Voss had been, for that moment, a man rather than a survivor. That moment was not retrievable. What it had cost him to lose it was not something he could calculate in the astropath's tower with 15 minutes on his clock. He filed it with everything else and started moving. Genestealer cults did not kill indiscriminately. That was the canonical truth buried in every Departamento Munitorum briefing that had ever mentioned them in his hearing. They were patient, purposive, operating on timelines that made individual tactical decisions legible only in retrospect. They had not killed Voss in the first 4 days of their presence, which meant they wanted something from him. What a lone surviving guardsman on an isolated station had to offer a Genestealer cult, he did not know. Voss knew he did not know, and the not knowing was the most dangerous part, because it meant he could not predict the moment they stopped needing him to be alive. He needed to reach the evacuation shuttle. He worked through the problem during the morning patrol circuit, maintaining the normal rhythm of his daily movement, nodding to the 2 squad members he passed in the corridor with the easy acknowledgement of a man who had no idea he was performing. The shuttle bay was in the station's lower quarter, accessible via a single corridor that did not pass through the barracks. The craft itself was a standard emergency configuration, rated for 6, stocked for 48 hours transit, launch sequence that could be completed by one person in approximately 3 minutes. He did not know if they had touched it. He did not know if they had compromised the launch systems, or sealed the bay, or placed someone inside the craft itself in the posture of waiting that he now understood was simply how they rested. He did not know if crossing the corridor to the bay would be the moment they understood he knew. If they did not already, if Fenn's wave in the dark had not been a communication rather than a demonstration. What he knew was that not going was also a choice, and the longer he did not go, the more completely that choice was made for him. Breakfast was at 800. He went. He sat across from Fenn and 2 seats down from Osler, and he ate his ration paste, and he made conversation. He asked about the hull integrity check. Fenn gave him a thorough, technically accurate assessment of 3 minor stress fractures in the lower hull plating that required no immediate action, but should be logged for the next scheduled maintenance cycle. Voss asked follow-up questions. Fenn answered them. Osler ate nothing, as always, and offered the occasional dry commentary that landed with the precise comic timing of something that had studied the mechanics of dry commentary carefully. Voss laughed at one. He felt it happen, the genuine article, up from the chest, before he could stop it, and his own laughter was the worst sound in the room. Because Fenn smiled in response, warm and easy, and real in every surface quality of real, and Voss could not find the seam. That was the horror they had built, not the wrongness. He had catalogued the wrongness, he had burned the list, he knew what it added up to. The horror was that the rightness was still there, still working. The thing that made him laugh at breakfast was still operating, and the part of him that responded to it could not be disabled by knowledge, and he had to sit with both simultaneously and continue eating paste and making conversation and not let his hands shake. He finished his meal. He thanked them for the company. He walked out of the mess bay and down the corridor to the junction outside the barracks and sat with his back against the wall, pressed his hands against his face, and breathed through his mouth until his shoulders stopped. He allowed himself 90 seconds. He had counted to 63 when he heard footsteps, real ones, sounding on the grating the way footsteps should, and stood up before they reached the junction. He went to the shuttle bay at 1400. The corridor was empty. He moved without hurrying. Hurrying was information, and everything he did now was information, and reached the bay door and worked the manual release and stepped inside. The craft was there. He had not fully believed it would still be there until this moment, and the relief of it was physical, something releasing in his chest, a breath he had been holding since 0300 without knowing it. He crossed the bay, ran his hands along the hull, checked the launch cradle mountings, intact. He moved to the access hatch, cycled it, climbed inside and checked the fuel gauge, the life support, the navigational preset, fueled, sealed, undisturbed. He pressed his forehead against the pilot's console for 3 seconds. Then he climbed out, closed the hatch behind him, and turned to leave. Mediki Osler was standing at the entrance to the bay. She was not blocking it. She was simply present in it, her Mediki kit at her side, her dark eyes moving from Voss to the craft and back to Voss, with the calm attention of someone completing an observation they had begun before he arrived. She had been there long enough to have seen all of it. The silence between them lasted long enough to have a shape. "I've been wondering when you'd come here," she said. Her voice was the same, precisely the same. The dry, contained register he had heard every morning for 4 days. The voice that had told him about his cracked rib and his damaged knee, and used the word purpose where another person would have said something else. 3 seconds of silence, long enough to be deliberate, short enough to mean nothing, long enough to mean everything. "You should get some sleep, Caden." She tilted her head slightly, the gesture of a professional offering reasonable advice. "We launch in the morning." She turned and walked out of the bay. Her footsteps did not sound on the corridor grating. Voss stood between the shuttle and the door and could not move for a very long time. He turned it over. He examined it from every angle available to him. A threat. She had seen him check the shuttle and was telling him she knew. A test. They were determining whether he would run and when, and what he would do under pressure. A warning. Something in her that was not entirely what it appeared to be, reaching toward him through the only language available to it. Or nothing. The most terrible possibility, nothing. A Mediki telling an isolated survivor to rest before departure, and a damaged man reading conspiracy into ordinary words because he had been in the dark too long and seen too many things, and his signal to noise had finally and completely failed him. He could not determine which was true. He stood in the shuttle bay with the craft behind him and the empty corridor ahead, and every system in his body producing the same unresolvable output. And he thought about the litany. "The Emperor is my armor." And his mouth formed the opening line and stopped. He did not sleep that night. Chapter 5. What comes home? He made it. That's the part he keeps telling himself. He made it. He got out. He's home. He says it like a prayer. And that's how he knows something is wrong. The shuttle had launched. He returns to this fact the way a tongue returns to a missing tooth. Not because it gives comfort, but because it is the load-bearing truth on which everything else rests. The shuttle launched. He had run the sequence with shaking hands in the amber dark of the bay, while somewhere in the station's corridors, something that wore Osler's face was telling the others, and the magnetic clamps had released with the sound of the only prayer that had worked in 15 days, and the void had taken him. He does not know why they let him go. He has constructed 17 explanations across the weeks since, testing each one for structural integrity before it collapses under the weight of what he actually knows about genestealer cults, which is that they do not make mistakes, and they do not let things go accidentally, and they are patient in ways that geological formations are patient. He has decided that understanding why is a door he cannot open from the outside, and that he will spend the remainder of whatever life the Emperor permits him walking in the same direction as that door and never reaching it, and that this is acceptable. This is the tax on survival. He pays it daily. He made it. He got out. He says it like a prayer. That's how he knows. The debriefing had taken 4 days. Standard protocol for a recovered, isolated survivor. Regimental medici assessment. Psychological stability evaluation. 2 formal sessions with an intelligence officer to reconstruct the sequence of events at Vigil Actual. The medici found the cracked rib. Osler had found it first, he did not say. And the ligament damage, and the weight loss, and the particular kind of systemic fatigue that accumulated in the body, like sediment over prolonged high-stress isolation. They treated what was treatable. They documented what wasn't. A regimental chirurgeon told him he was doing well, given the circumstances, and meant it in the clinical sense of the term, which was the only sense that applied. He performed recovery with the same precision he had performed normalcy across the last days on Vigil Actual. He ate, he slept, or produced the appearance of sleeping, which by then was close enough to the same thing that the distinction had ceased to matter. He answered questions with the calibrated honesty of a man who had been trained by 15 days in a confined space with 12 things that were very good at identifying useful information. He told them about the attack, the systematic elimination of the station's complement, the astropath's sealed tower. He told them Senna had locked herself in on day 3 and he had found no evidence of what had become of her, which was accurate in the way that all his best omissions were accurate. He told them about the 11 days alone, the decision to maintain the log, the distress beacon, the Vox contact on day 11. He told them Relief Squad Auric had arrived and secured the station and identified the craft as evacuation ready, and that he had departed on their recommendation when it became clear the station's structural integrity was compromised beyond short-term habitation. Every word of this was true. He had assembled it carefully. The truth, correctly arranged, covered the shape of what he was not saying the way amber light covered shadows, not concealing them exactly, just making them harder to see. The inquisitorial attaché came on the 3rd day. She was introduced without elaboration, a woman of middle years with the contained, professionally warm manner of someone who had been conducting interviews for long enough that genuine attentiveness had become indistinguishable from the performance of it. She did not offer a name. He did not ask for one. She sat across from him with a data slate she rarely looked at, and asked questions in the unhurried sequence of someone following a map they had already memorized. The first session covered Vigil Actual's strategic function, the timeline of the attack, the disposition of the station's complement. Standard, he answered. She listened in the particular way she listened, fully present, cataloguing behind the warmth. And he recognized it, distantly, as a version of what he himself had been doing for the last 4 days of his time on the station. The second session ended differently. She had closed her data slate. She had done the small, visible things that signaled the formal portion of an interview was complete. The slight shift in posture, the contained exhale, the gathering of materials. And then, from this position of apparent conclusion, she had looked at him directly and asked in the same even tone she had used throughout, "Did you notice anything unusual about the relief squad's behavior?" The silence that followed lasted perhaps 2 seconds. He had spent 15 days training himself to produce 2-second silences that looked like consideration rather than calculation. He produced one now. "No," he said. "They were professional, effective. I was grateful for them." She nodded, made a small notation, closed the data slate fully, and thanked him for his time and told him he was cleared for reassignment, which came through the following morning. He has thought about this exchange every day since, not with relief. Relief was what he had felt for approximately 6 hours after the clearance came through, before the thinking started. What replaced relief was something with no clean name, a specific, growing unease that lived in the 2-second silence before his no, and in the notation she had made afterward, and in the question itself, not its content, but its placement, after the formal close, from the position of apparent conclusion. The correct answer to her question was one she already knew. He was increasingly certain of this. His no had confirmed something for her, had completed a picture she was constructing, in a way that a yes would have complicated. He did not know what the picture was. He did not know what she was. He had decided with the firm deliberateness of a man building a wall against a specific direction, not to think about it. Some doors opened inward. You kept them closed by not leaning. The garrison world was called Thessar 4, and it was the color of old iron under a sun that never quite reached warm. He had been assigned to a holding company pending redeployment, standard procedure for recovered isolated personnel, while the Departamento Munitorum decided where the pieces fit. He had a bunk, a mess schedule, a patrol rotation that asked nothing of him that 11 days on Vigil Actual had not thoroughly prepared him for. His bunkmate was a man named Corvel. 20 years of service, 2 campaign ribbons, the specific unhurried competence of a soldier who had been doing this long enough to have stopped performing it. He was affable in the manner of veterans who had learned that affability was more efficient than its alternatives. Not warm exactly, but frictionless. He offered Voss the lower bunk without being asked. He did not ask questions about Vigil Actual. He talked about small things, the garrison's recaf, the patrol rotation's inefficiencies, a card game that ran on the 3rd night of every rest cycle and was worth attending if you didn't mind losing moderately. Voss found him easy to be around. This registered distantly as a warning, and he noted it and let it sit. The nightmare came on the 3rd night. He did not remember its content afterward. He rarely did now. What he retained was the sensation of it, amber light falling upward, the sound of a prayer being said too perfectly, the specific quality of silence that was not the absence of sound, but the absence of people. He woke with his heart doing the old Vigil Actual rhythm, the elevated functional beat of threat assessment, and lay still in the dark, breathing through his mouth, waiting for his body to receive the message that it was over. He looked at the upper bunk. Corvel was on his back, arms straight, eyes closed, face upward, perfectly still. Voss watched. He counted his own heartbeats. It was either that or look away, and looking away had made the list, back on the station, and he was done with making lists and then burning them. He watched Corvel in the dark and counted. Genuine sleep had a texture to it. The body's unconscious maintenance, the small shift of weight as circulation redistributed, the slight movement of the chest that was never perfectly metronomic, the occasional micro-adjustment of the hands or jaw, the 10,000 tiny recalibrations that a living body performed without instruction. He had memorized this texture over 3 nights of watching the relief squad's picked feed and finding its absence. Corvel did not shift, did not adjust. His chest rose and fell with the perfect regularity of a metronome, set to the correct value and held there. Voss counted 11 minutes. At the end of the 11th minute, Corvel's eyes opened. He looked at the ceiling. The pause lasted 3 seconds, long enough to be deliberate, short enough to be deniable. And then his head turned and he looked at Voss, and his expression was the easy, unguarded expression of a man surfacing from sleep. "Bad dream," he said. "Yeah," Voss said. Corvel nodded, with the slow economy of a man not fully awake, and rolled onto his side and closed his eyes. His breathing resumed, even, regular, metronomic. Voss lay in the dark until the garrison's first light cycle began, and the amber of the emergency strips gave way to the standard white of morning. And he did not move, and did not sleep, and did not report it. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself he was damaged. The chirurgeon had used the word hypervigilant in the medical notes he had read over the man's shoulder, which was accurate, which was expected, which was a known and documented consequence of the kind of experience he had survived. He told himself that still sleepers existed, that some bodies ran quiet in rest, that 11 minutes of observation by a man who had been awake for 19 hours was not evidence of anything except his own compromised reliability as a witness. He told himself all of this. He almost believed it. Almost was the tax. He paid it and rose for morning patrol, and did not look at Corvel as he left, and told himself he would file a transfer request for different quarters when the administrative window opened, and told himself he would probably not. He says the litany of endurance alone. He has been saying it since Vigil Actual, or trying to. The habit had survived the station, the shuttle, the debriefing, the garrison, the 3 weeks of Thessa 4's iron-colored mornings. It was the one ritual he had carried out of the dark intact, or nearly intact, or intact in the way that a structural element looks intact, until you apply weight and find where the crack runs. He says it quietly, in the minutes before patrol, standing in the corridor outside his quarters, where the light is the standard white of functional spaces and not amber, and does not fall upward. He says the opening line, "The Emperor is my armor against the darkness," and the second line, which he had never been able to retrieve on Vigil Actual, and which came back to him the week after debriefing, with the sudden, involuntary return of things the mind has been protecting you from. "The Emperor is my purpose in the void." He reaches the third line. His mouth closes. He starts again. He tells himself it is practice. Repetition was how you rebuilt things that had been said to pieces, how you returned meaning to words that had become sound. He says the opening line, the second line. He reaches the third. His mouth closes. He has not said the third line since Vigil Actual. He is not certain what lives on the other side of it now, whether the remainder of the litany is still there, waiting, or whether something has moved into that space in the 15 days on the station and the weeks since, something that he cannot see and cannot name and cannot catalogue on a list that he can burn. He starts again. He reaches the line. His mouth closes. Around him, the corridor is quiet. The recyclers hum. The light is white and functional and falls in the correct direction. Somewhere in the garrison, Corvel is beginning his own patrol rotation, and somewhere beyond the garrison walls, Thessa 4 turns its iron face toward its insufficient sun, and somewhere further than that, in the void between systems, a relay station designated Vigil Actual is either still standing or it is not, and either something is still waiting inside it, or it has moved on to the next patient stop along the path that cults like this one had been walking since before the Imperium knew their name. He does not know. He will not know. He starts again. He had been counting the dead for 11 days when the Vox crackled and someone answered. He still doesn't know what day it is now. He stopped counting when he ran out of names he was sure of. This is Voidborn Terrors. If this story found you, if it sat with you, If it made you look at the person beside you for a half-second too long, then it did what it was built to do. The archive continues. The vigil holds. We will see you in the dark.